Welcome to Adventures in Solitaire. Today we'll be reviewing Legends Untold. So, what is Legends Untold? Well, let's take a look at the box. So, this is from the Weeping Caves novice set. Just for the record, I do have the Great Sewers novice set, as well as there were three boosters that came with it as well. So, there may be some additional content, not necessarily from the Great Sewers novice set, but possibly from the boosters there. So, what does it say here? Your people, the Sacs, have been driven out of their lands by the invasion of the newcomers, forced into retreat by these heavily armored elves and their powerful magic. You have managed to save those that you can and gather them on the outskirts of the mighty city of Dun Mordain. In Legends Untold, 1 to 4 players take on the role of unlikely heroes, the final hope of a conquered people. Starting with only your wits and a crude weapon, you will explore the Weeping Caves, trying to gain access to the great free city of Dun Mordain. Inspired by adventure books, RPGs, and fantasy board games, Legends Untold offers a deep adventuring experience that sets up in 5 minutes, has no player downtime, and you can finish in an hour. Legends Untold can be played with up to 8 players, provided you have 2 core sets. And when it's talking about the 2 core sets, it's primarily speaking about that alternate set, the Great Sewers Novice set. So, how does it play? What are the mechanics? What does that look like? So, I think we probably are best to start out with the characters. They are the central part of this story, after all, and they're who you will be playing. Now, the current setup that I have has 2 characters on the board. It does have the option to play with 1 character, though I would say that's probably pretty daunting. I have chosen 2 characters just because it's easier for me to manage, and that seems to be about the right spot for me for these types of games, which encourage more than 1 player character. Overall, I would say that it's definitely better for me as a solo experience than with another player, but let's go ahead and let's proceed. So, your characters, when they start with a basic setup, you'll get a really basic weapon, you'll get a few skills, and you'll have your character card. On the character card itself, you'll note that there are a couple of places for extra places for equipment. We have a place for kit and a place for armor and clothing, things like that. In the basic setup, you don't have that. That's something you get later as your characters develop and level. There is leveling in this game, and a decent amount of it too. I was pleasantly surprised. You will notice that both characters have knives that they can use should their primary weapon not be pulling its weight or that something happens with that. Which is good in the case of the archer because he has no melee weapon with the exception of his knife that he has built in there on his card. The characters also have attributes. These attributes are not used for really anything outside of what we might normally consider a difficulty check or at what we might know from role playing as a DC. And they have plenty of that in the game. Below, we'll also see that the characters have skills. They get 1 weapon skill and a couple of skills for your choice there. I went with the basic setup, the suggested setup. You can modify that as you will within the rules that they provide. The skills allow you to do things like mitigate and mainly mitigate die rolls. The die rolls, speaking of which, you get 3 6-sided dice. I do find it worth mentioning that these are not the dice that comes in the base game. The dice in the base game are black. These are a bit of an upgrade. And so that's it pretty much for the characters with 1 exception. We do notice that there is may or you may notice that there's something missing. We are missing health on these cards, and health is handled in a really unique way, and it's handled in a way that I really appreciate because it's pretty thematic. As you are doing anything in any game, specifically this game, your character is going to get exhausted. They can't just go, go, go. So as they use a skill, it gets exhausted. And as they continue on, they may become more exhausted. And if you're in a situation where you happen to have some damage occur, that will also exhaust. Now, that doesn't necessarily hurt you, but it will if you end up in a situation where all of your cards are exhausted. If all of your cards are exhausted and you're forced to take damage, let's say you took one damage, you would rotate your card to the correct position or its normal position, and you would flip it to indicate the damage has occurred. If there is a situation where you would be forced to turn over the last card, your character is unconscious. And that's not it's a deal. You don't want that to happen. It takes a lot to get yourself in a state where you are returned to normality of all of your cards in their upright state. But it's not a big deal in that, they can continue on. In fact, they could probably continue on in the next round. The only really bad thing about it is if you have all of your characters where they have all flipped their cards. That's it. That would be what you would call your party wipe. Now, in the normal game, a party wipe just means that you just need to start your scenario over again, and there's no consequences other than the fact that you've lost some personal time on it. So I really like that mechanic. I like the fact that you can kind of push yourself a little too far before you engage, or the engagement itself has worn you out and you need to rest. At the end of every turn, you do get the ability to, in fact, you don't get the ability, you have to rest. And when that happens, all of your cards, with no expenditure of any time, we'll cover time in a minute, are then unexhausted. They're returned to their normal state. If you have a situation where you have one that is shown for or flipped over for damage, that does not get flipped. That's something that you have to spend some time to heal. And that's where I say that it's not so bad if you take damage or you're unconscious, but it's going to take time to heal, and time is a very valuable resource. So the next thing we might want to cover is why we're here. Why are we doing any of this? Why are characters here? Well, beyond the main campaign, there is a campaign in it. I think it's 8 scenarios long. There is a pass-fail mechanic. Basically, what you're trying to do is just ensure that you succeed as often as you can at these scenarios because at the very end, there's a scoring mechanic that kind of tells you what happens and how you did based on the successes and failures. So whenever you start your first campaign mission or scenario, it will give a description of that scenario. It will tell you exactly how to set it up. It will tell you how many cards in each deck that you need. And depending on difficulty, and I would recommend this one. This one's it's tough enough as it is here. This just makes it tougher. There's some white numbers there and some brown numbers in brown. It'll also show rules. So each scenario will have its own little thing that you have to keep track of. The thing that we all tend to forget when we're playing because we're just used to going through the basic rules. And then the goal, what you need to do to end the current scenario and have a victory. So what about defeat? How does that happen? Well, besides an outright party wipe or you not achieving what's here, you can run out of time. So you have a deck of cards for time, and it's very small. I think there's 6 times time in a core set. And it looks like you probably only have about 6 turns or 6 time units to go through here, but that's not quite the case. It's kind of interesting how it works. So if I take an action and it takes 2 time, what I'll do is I will draw 2 time cards. The last time card I draw will take the form of an event. The other card will go in a discard pile. This event may or may not affect you. If it doesn't, you get rid of it from the game. If it does, you complete the event and then you get rid of it from the game. So in this way, you'll go through your deck until you run out and then you'll shuffle it back. But if you took note, we're still in a situation where you have 6 turns roughly. And that's actually a decent amount, but you do have the ability through various things that will happen in the game, just player actions that will cause more time to be added. Good rolls, for example, can help that in some cases for time to be added. So what does it look like while we're traveling through this system? Well, you start out with one card. These others would not yet have been revealed, and you'll take a look at the different features of the card, and from there, after you have done a move, and of course when you start, you haven't done a move, but let's say that I've decided I'm going to move into here. You'll immediately look at the card, and you will see if there's any obstacles blocking your way. In this case, this card shows an obstacle. Okay, and then you would draw that said obstacle. You would try to pass that obstacle. Most of these obstacles, whether they be a true obstacle or there being a barrier on the card here, it does show a barrier. They will give you some sort of test to pass, and it will tell you what happens based on your rolls. And some of them will give you choices, some of them won't give you choices, some of them will be for one character, some of them will be for the entire party. When you're moving initially, before you even have a chance to get to the barriers, one of the mechanics of the game is the idea of your level of readiness. You start out with a readiness, a bold, and whenever you want to travel, you have to look at these little light symbols. It tells you how light, how much, ambient. If it's ambient, is it well lit? Is it just completely dark? And that's going to affect a couple of things. If it's completely dark, you're going to be well hidden, but you're also not going to see things like traps. Well hidden helps you against enemies, but it doesn't help you see those traps you may run into. And it goes the opposite way. If it's very bright when you're entering into the next area, you're going to be seen by, it's going to be a lot easier for the enemies to see you and possibly surprise you, whereas you're going to be able to detect those traps pretty easily. Your lighting can be affected by some skills and some items, but most of the time, especially in the beginning, you're going to be completely dependent upon the light from the room that you're coming from. You do have the choice to spend some time, to move quietly. And if you do so, you get a +2 to your alertness, or sorry, your readiness roll. You would roll your die, you would add your +2 if you had it, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then you would check and see if it was equal to or greater than the light indicator on the room that you're in. In this case, we are ambient light. I need to roll an 8 or above, and I did. And it says if it's between 0 and +3, which is what we scored, it wasn't, I think it was, what do we get? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I only got one above. So it's definitely between 0 and 3. So I would be in a bold stance. Had I rolled really well, then I would have been alert. And all this means is that it gives you additional options and advantages, and it's a lot harder for you to become surprised by an enemy. So we've talked a little bit about lighting. We've talked a little bit about readiness. You definitely don't want to be careless. We've talked about obstacles and barriers. The other thing that we have is we have the adventure deck, and there will be moments where you will be required. It's actually the biggest deck in the game, and this is all the adventure deck is completely governed by the setup of the scenario. It tells you everything to include in and how much. You will draw from the adventure deck. If you see that there is a monster icon in the room, you have to face that monster. It's there, it's present, and you'll be required to draw until you reach that particular type of adventure card. So there we are. We have something called a rock hide, and we would stop there. The rules also say that if you see any treasure cards, you set them to the side, and those are the treasures you'll gain if you are successful in making them run away or defeating them. In other cases, you may be required to draw for an environment card. So we have here a runestone, curiosity, and then we can choose to take this, as it says one hero may. And so with those, you would, just like the monster, you draw them up, and any treasure that you may find, you get to put to the side. And if you're successful, you get the treasure, and you also get whatever the card says there. So as you're going through, as you're making your way through the dungeon with your character, or the caves or whatever environment you're in, as you're making your way through, you absolutely are going to be spending time. And once that time deck runs out, you lose the ability to use your skills, and the whole thing gets really hard to the point that you either have to be right there at the cusp of victory, or you're not going to win that scenario. In this particular scenario that I've set up, the goal is to find these two cards, which it asked me to place on the bottom of the deck. This is the warning note and the tattered map. And on my first playthrough, I was able to do that. And that's a lot of cards to whittle through despite this small time deck. So that it really does give you a lot more time than you might otherwise think. So what happens in a situation where you would enter into combat? Let's find a good character, for example, for combat. All right. Here we have, if I can get the pronunciation right, Egyptoid slavers. They're both a melee and a ranged character. So the way that it works is that if they have the element of surprise on you, you will have what's called a disadvantage. And the disadvantage just means that one or possibly more of your characters are going to be rolling at a -2 modifier. If you have advantage, you get a roll at a +2 modifier. So, assuming all things being equal and there's no advantage or disadvantage, you have two phases, a range phase and a melee phase. And initially, in the very first turn, you're always allowed to have ranged and then melee. Later on, those rules change a little bit. So it's basically simulating the fact that your party hasn't yet come together in that melee range yet. So those archers first get that turn to engage. So what you would do is you would roll for the enemy in case of surprise, and you would compare it to their range table. You right there. The enemies also will not have a melee table, which we'll discuss in a moment. Melee's handled a little bit easier. So you'll look at the table, you'll roll, you'll add your total, in which case this is 9, 10, 11. You'll compare it, and it looks like he's going to push our characters back, and one of our characters is going to get disadvantage. I would then have a chance to engage in range myself, in which case I do have a ranged character with a rough bow. I would roll, check for my advantage or disadvantage. Before the roll, preferably, I don't want to see if I had any skills I wanted to use. There are a few skills that'll let you do it after you roll, but most of them are before. I'd look at my total. In this case, I've got a 9. I would look at my I would make my roll. I would look at my character. In this case, I've got a 9. And on his bow, it says that between or from an 8 to a 10, because it's not quite hit 11 on my card, I would just miss. If I get a 7 or below, I've actually would end up striking one of my own characters. I've not just missed, I've had a critical failure. I would need an 11 to cause an advantage for one of my characters, a 13 to get damage, and a 15 for a critical. And it also says I have infinite ammo for this specific weapon. Or I say advantage for one of my characters. I think that's actually a disadvantage. So once the range has phase is finalized, you'll then go to melee. And melee is much simpler. All you have to do with melee is look at your melee character, make your roll, and then see what happens. The biggest difference on the melee is that you're rolling not just for yourself but for the monsters. Because if you roll like say a 9 or a 10 for this weapon, you and the creature are going to do damage to each other. If you roll an 8, then you're going to be pushed back, and 7 or less, you're looking at damage. So looking further on the monster's card, it says if I have two players, it shows a couple of busts of characters there, then I'm going to be fighting three enemies. But it also says that if there is one enemy left at the end of a round, this character will flee. Now I have the option to continue to pursue them and finish them off, but the character will flee. So I would need to do 3 points of damage to this character. And when they first come out, these creatures, they come out with markers that indicate their how many they have. So if I'd done 1 damage, they'd have 2. We'd fight another round. If I did another damage at the end of that round, they would run away. Because we are dealing with three dice, it might seem like we have a better chance to hit, but the game is balanced in such a way that you really do need to you have to ask yourself whether you want to use mitigating techniques with your cards or not, with your skills. Because on its own, for my forge hand, she has to roll a 13 or above out of dice that only go up to 18. So the odds are not in her favor to hit without using something to help mitigate that. Also, additionally, on the monster cards, some of them will have a advantage, or sorry, not advantage or disadvantage, but they will have a modifier to use weapon or ranged against them. Ranged characters, for example, tend to be weak against melee, and melee uh, tend to be the opposite there. The game has multiple different game modes available. The primary one out of the box is the campaign mode, where they will give you very specific scenarios that you have to follow. After every scenario, you will level up. You'll begin to get better equipment, more skills, upgraded equipment. And then the other game modes that are available are kind of like a create your own or a choose your own scenario. One is more of kind of like an endless mode where you just keep pressing and you just try to see how long you can last. It's almost kind of like a rogue light type situation. So that's pretty much it for the gameplay. I say pretty much it, but there is a lot going on with with this game. So let's have some closing thoughts here. This, as far as the theme of the game, I think it does a really good job with its theme. It definitely does. A lot of the mechanics make sense for what they're saying in the cards, why you're doing what you're doing, why everything works the way it does. Everything just meshes really well. Um, it still can at times for me feel like I get in this mode where I stop reading the flavor text and I just start going for numbers, right? Or I start looking for keywords. And I love the fact that they have the keywords emboldened so I can do that. But because otherwise that would be an annoyance of itself if I had to read the same thing every time to help remind myself. But on the other hand, I kind of miss out on that theme if I do that. So I have to kind of in my head force myself to read everything so that I have that feeling of being in that setting and fighting those things or overcoming those challenges as opposed to okay, what's this challenge number? All right, I've got that, and what do I lose? What do I get? How much time do I need to spend? And I don't end up in a situation like that. So I really do think the theme has done well, really well, better than most that I have that have the heavy dungeon delving mechanics. The game does feel very much old school. It reminds me of a much more visceral, tangible, choose your own adventure style book in the way that some of these challenges are laid out. That you're having to select: do you want to do this or do you want to do this? If so, this happens, or if you roll this, then turn to this page. This has that feel to it. It definitely feels very old school role playing game. It feels like there's almost as if I might have a dungeon master kind of walking around in the distance, waiting for me to make up my mind. As far as the quality of the content, it's what I expect. The card quality, the art, everything is exactly what I expect, and that's not a bad thing. Um, there have definitely been times where things have failed to meet those expectations, and that's not great. But this definitely meets those expectations. There's nothing in the core set that really stands out aside from possibly the insert. It does have a nice plastic insert. You can kind of get your fingers in there to get your cards. Sleeve cards do fit a little tight in this, but I'm glad that they gave a really sturdy insert. Overall, I think it's a great game. As far as whether or not this will be one that stays in my library, time will tell. I'm going to continue playing with it and seeing how it goes. I've got two expansions to work through, and we'll see if I can do 40 scenarios. I doubt that'll happen. But definitely keeping it there for now for its feel. It is very unique. I don't have any other game system that does what this does. I will say that there looks like there's a Kickstarter on the horizon. When this initially launched, there was this promise of this huge overarching campaign that they were going to do. Whenever you're presented with a situation where you get a season of something, you always want that next season, and this next season has been a long time coming. There's definitely been some teasing of something much more grand, and so it looks like they do have a Kickstarter coming up pretty soon. As far as the availability of the game is concerned, I know that the boosters are really hard to get a hold of, at least in the U.S. And I looked elsewhere, and it doesn't look like they're that much easier elsewhere. And then as far as the main boxes, I think you can still get a hold of those at a reasonable price if you're still interested in playing the game. I don't really think the game needs those boosters. Think really what you're looking at is a couple of the other characters and some additional minor treasures. So if you like role playing, you like choose your own adventure style, that old school in a box board game type setting, it might be worth your while to take a look at. I definitely recommend it to friends or family. And that's all for Legends Untold.